We're back with part 2 of our look at the Italian Wars. Last time we took a quick look at a wide array of seemingly unrelated topics, from the Treaty of Tordesillas to the conquest of Constantinople, from Cumana to death by door lintel. Having laid the groundwork, today we will look more closely at the events that occurred on the Italian peninsula. But just like last time we looked at not just events in Italy, today we will look at actions not just of popes and kings. Because this was the time of the Borgias and Medicis, no longer just merchants and bankers, but also popes and kings. While the Borgias were at this time established as a noble house, a century earlier, the scion of the house, Juan Domingo de Borgia, was making his fortune in the sugar trade. The sugar trade, of course, was heavily reliant on slave labor. The Borgia family, through their ambition, definitely earned their notoriety, and were accused of everything from nepotism and theft to poisoning and witchcraft. There seem to have been attempts over the years to rehabilitate their image, which tends to be accomplished first by dismissing the more serious allegations, such as holding orgies in the Vatican, and secondly by saying that other noble families were also guilty of theft and nepotism. Obviously, proving malicious rumors centuries after the fact is basically impossible, so it could be true that modern historians are correct to dismiss them. But on the other hand, one of my biggest pet peeves when it comes to historical research is the tendency to dismiss all sensational claims out of hand. It is possible the Borgias weren't as bad as their contemporaries made them out to be, but it's also possible that they were actually worse. This is one of the biggest lessons we can learn from history. The truth can be incredibly nuanced. At the onset of the Italian Wars, the Pope is Alexander VI, also known as Rodrigo Borgia. He issued the papal bull, Inter Caetera, that was the basis for the Treaty of Tordesillas. But he also supported the French in their invasion of Italy. So remember what I said about the siege of Constantinople in the previous video? Well, it turns out that Charles VIII used the idea of a crusade against the Ottomans as the pretext for his army to invade Italy. Why anyone would believe that beats me, because it seems that you'd have to go by sea or otherwise through Hungary, not through southern Italy. If you're going to go by sea, then why not get in a boat either in southern France or in Genoa? What is interesting is that apparently the Pope at this point asks the Ottomans for help in fending off the French. The Ottomans actually paid a massive tribute to the Vatican in return for keeping the Sultan Bayezid's brother, Cem, a prisoner. And as for the French king attempting to launch a crusade against the Ottomans, within about 30 years of the start of the Italian Wars, France and the Ottomans would be in an alliance. The infamous Franco-Ottoman alliance. My perspective is, if we're told about the Ottoman tribute paid to the Vatican and the Franco-Ottoman alliance, what aren't we told about? For example, drawing upon the work of Anatoly Fomenko once more, could Muscovy and the Ottomans have been in alliance at this time? It's worth mentioning that Russia and the Ottomans didn't war against one another until very late in the 17th century, although there was a brief conflict around 1569. Now, if I had a nickel for every time I read about the Ottomans being mischaracterized simply as Turks or Muslims, Rumelia, Morea, Serbia, Bulgaria, Crimea. It sounds like the siege of 1453 and the rise of the Ottomans is going to require its own video. But we've still barely touched the Italian Wars. So after Charles VIII invaded Italy, passed through Rome, and took Naples with minimum effort, the north of Italy realized this was a threat they would have to address. And in order to do so, they would have to cooperate with one another. As such, they formed the League of Venice. Charles left a garrison in Naples and then started the long voyage back to France with the rest of his army. The League stopped his progress a day's march south of Parma, and the Battle of Fornovo was fought. Both sides proclaimed themselves the victor because the French lost their baggage train, but the League had higher casualties, and they were unable to prevent Charles's army from continuing on to France. A few months later, though, the French garrison in Naples was defeated, reversing all of Charles's gains. The peninsula, though, had been shown to be both rich and weak, in the sense that cooperation seemed to be difficult, and the Italian states did not employ standing armies, but rather enlisted mercenaries, known as condottieri, contractors. In 1498, the dreaded door lintel struck, and Charles VIII died. He was replaced by his cousin, whose rebellion, the Mad War, he had previously put down. Foul play? I'll leave that to you to decide. So the Duke of Orleans becomes King Louis XII. Does he resemble Vladimir Putin? Again, I'll leave that to you to decide. So although the Italians had worked together to evict the French, that did not mean everyone was ready to get along. Florence, in the hands of the Medici, and Rome, under a Borgia pope, had a rather notorious rivalry. Venice and Genoa, too, were always in competition. The French king and the King of Aragon decided that rather than fight over southern Italy, they would split it between them. Sharing is caring, after all. I know this will come as a shock, but the arrangement didn't last. Within 5 years, Spanish and French troops were at each other's throats, and two major battles were fought in 1503 at Cerinola and Garigliano. At the first battle, the Spanish were able to pioneer the use of arquebusiers, who were placed in a trench in front of a palisade, which they could retreat behind in case of a charge. The French at this point had established a tradition of winning battles primarily through the use of heavy cavalry. So, predictably enough, they tried to charge the Spanish trenches. I don't know about you, but that just sounds ill-fated. Some of the horses fell into the trenches, and others were subject to intense musket fire. The battle devolved into a push of pike, but the French and their Swiss mercs were still being fired upon from their flank. The French retreated and as a result suffered heavy losses. The Spanish, however, were not able to successfully besiege the French at their fortress, mainly because it was being supplied by sea. 8 months later, the Spanish had been reinforced and they were ready to try again. By this time, there was also a new pope. Rodrigo Borgia had been replaced by Papa Julio, who decided to name himself after Julius Caesar. The Spanish were able to construct a makeshift pontoon bridge and thus catch the French off guard. The reason I mention the change in Pope, as well as the change in King of France, is because historically speaking, the most straightforward way to change a kingdom or state's policy and allegiances was via a change in leader. A new leader, a new faction in charge, and new policies. The new pope, it seems, was not a fan of the Borgias, and had this to say: "I will not live in the same rooms as the Borgias lived. He desecrated the Holy Church as none before. He usurped the papal power by the devil's aid, and I forbid under the pain of excommunication anyone to speak or think of Borgia again. His name and memory must be forgotten. It must be crossed out of every document and memorial. His reign must be obliterated. All paintings made of the Borgias or for them must be covered over with black crepe. All the tombs of the Borgias must be opened and their bodies sent back to where they belong, to Spain." Sounds like another one of those orders to rewrite history, if you ask me. Now, between Borgia and Julio, there was another pope who was elected as a sort of compromise between the Borgias and other influential families, but he only lived for about a month after his election. Naturally, there are allegations that he was poisoned. In the next phase of the Italian Wars, from around 1508 to 1516, Pope Julio decided he wanted to expel the barbarians, the Spanish in the south and the French to the north. But after a while, the Pope seemed to have a change of heart and singled out Venice, whose land-based empire had been growing for some time. France, Spain, and the Papal States actually formed a short-lived alliance against Venice, but as soon as progress was made, it seems one of the allies would switch sides to prevent any single kingdom from becoming too powerful. For example, the French won an important victory against Venice, but not long thereafter, they were allying with them. Now, I don't want to speculate too much, but it is interesting that the Pope in the early 16th century modeled himself after Julius Caesar, and that the man who became Holy Roman Emperor not long after, Charles V, modeled himself after Charlemagne. Now, we still haven't discussed the Battle of Pavia, the Tercios and Landknechts, the reign of Charles V, the first man of who it was said ruled a kingdom on which the sun never set, but we'll have to leave that for next time. Remember to hit that like, subscribe, check out my book, and until next time, stay critical.